I want to talk to you today about the philosophical views underlying the totalitarian regime in George Orwell's novel 1984. I think he does hold that the entire edifice of Ingsoc rests on a certain kind of philosophical conception, ultimately an idealistic conception. There's a sense in which totalitarianism, Orwell thinks, rests on the foundation of idealism, on the idea that everything is dependent on the mind, and therefore that everything, including society, social order, human nature, human beings themselves, can be shaped by our ideas. Believing can make it so, and if that's true, believing a certain set of things can make it so that a proper social order can be founded on them. So we can reshape society, we can reshape ourselves if we simply reshape our ideas, reshape our language. I want to begin with the question of meaning. What is the meaning of human life? That may be the most fundamental philosophical question of all. Well, the answer underlying the totalitarianism in the book is simply that there is no meaning. Everything is ultimately meaningless. And it's that lack of meaning that ends up allowing for there to be a vacuum filled by whatever ideology the totalitarian supplies. Orwell talks about the deadly emptiness at the heart of things. There is, for the characters in the novel at least, a deadly emptiness at the heart of everything, at the heart of the society, at the heart of their own lives. You get the sense at their very being, there's something at the heart of them that is somehow empty. There is a criticism of the novel by certain literary critics that these characters aren't really very well developed. They aren't believable. They're really something like figures that are simply filled in by the ideological content of the novel. They don't have any real independent personalities. I think that's by design. It's not a question of literary incompetence that leads to that. It is the fact that there is a deadly emptiness at the heart of Winston Smith, at the heart of everybody really in the novel. None of them, even the really evil ones like O'Brien, truly have much at their center. They aren't true believers, true fanatics. They aren't rebels of some kind. Even Winston Smith is not really a rebel. In the end, they're all somewhat empty inside. And it's precisely that allows the society, the social order, Big Brother, to fill in whatever meaning he desires. Many people consequently interpret this novel as a novel that has despair at its heart. Isaac Rosenfeld, for example, says that Winston Smith's capitulation to Big Brother is Orwell finally yielding up the lifelong image, the character and style and habits of reason and restraint. I cannot conceive a greater despair. There is a sense in which the picture the novel paints is utterly bleak. It's a bleak vision of society, a bleak vision of human nature, a bleak vision of the future. And so if we think that Orwell was assuming that that was where we were headed, it's a pretty bleak and despairing view of everything, really. But I'm not sure that's the way Orwell thinks about it. He himself said, "I don't believe that the kind of society I describe necessarily will arrive, but I believe that something resembling it could arrive." I see the book not as a counsel of despair about an inevitably bleak future, but instead as a warning that too easily habits of thought and habits of political action can lead to such totalitarian conclusions. The bleakness of that 1984 future is not inevitable, but it is plausible, and it's something that we have to guard against. Notice that Ingsoc and the powers that be generally in 1984 have as their declared enemy individualism. Anything that suggests that individual human lives are of value, intrinsically or independently. Anything that assumes that people as individuals get to direct their own lives, get to actually say what they want, think what they want, practice what they want. All of that is, strictly speaking, out of bounds. So anything that suggested a taste for solitude, even to go for a walk by yourself, was always slightly dangerous in the world of 1984. There was a word for it in Newspeak, own life, it was called, meaning individualism and eccentricity. That's the great danger, own life. You can't act as if your life is your own, as if you get to direct it. That is a fundamental threat to the entire social order of 1984. And so individualism has to be stamped out. It's not so much a philosophical presupposition of collectivism as it is a recognition that individualism tends to entail things like freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of association, and within certain boundaries at least freedom of action. All of that has to be ruled out, all of that has to be fought in order for the totalitarian to truly be total, for it to exercise complete control over the social order and the people within it. It's for that reason that the only secure basis for oligarchy is collectivism. Wealth and privilege are most easily defended when they're possessed jointly. The so-called abolition of private property, which took place in the middle years of the century, meant in effect the concentration of property in far fewer hands than before. I think that's an important insight. Talking about the abolition of private property sounds like a good thing, and of course it's one of the fundamentals of communism, the fundamental principle of Marx. We have to abolish private property. In that way we eliminate the owners of the means of production, the bourgeoisie, and resolve the class conflict in favor of the proletariat. But that sounds as if everything is in effect being given to the proletariat, that ownership is being spread over the entire society. Orwell recognizes that in practice that's not the way it works. There is no mechanism by which individual people can exercise that kind of collective control together of the total property of the society. So what happens is that control of it is invested in a small number of hands. A smaller number of hands than actually had access to it under capitalism or under alternative schemes. Communism seems to involve getting rid of the owners of means of production and turning the means of production over to everyone. In practice, it means turning it over to a small group, the nomenklatura, to use the Russian term for it, this small elite, the new class, as Delas referred to it. It's a group that is in control of private property and gets to treat it however they want. The O'Briens of the world take over the means of production, and the Winston Smiths are left out of the picture completely. Well, what happens to private property happens to power in general. The slogan is power to the people, but in fact power gets collected by the nomenklatura, by the new class, by the people who are actually in charge of the institutions, nominally on behalf of the people, but in fact for the sake of themselves. And so what is their view of power? Well, it becomes something that initially is justified because it's going to be exercised for the good of the whole. In practice, it's exercised for the good of the nomenclatura themselves, for the people who end up in those positions of power. Power is collective, O'Brien assures him. The individual only has power insofar as he ceases to be an individual. And what is power? It's inflicting pain and humiliation. It is preserving one's own superior place as a member of the new class, as a member of the nomenklatura, against those who are actually the proletarians, or perhaps former members of the bourgeoisie. It doesn't really matter. In the end, to use Rousseau's image, a few are gorging themselves on luxuries because they've appointed themselves as the representatives of the people, while everybody else is denied even basic necessities. In the process, the party has to attack memory. It has to attack everything that could give an individual some basis for objecting to what those in charge do. And so it has to attack the past itself. The alteration of the past is necessary for two reasons. The party member must believe that he's better off than his ancestors, and that the average level of material comfort is constantly rising. But by far the more important reason for the readjustment of the past is the need to safeguard the infallibility of the party. The mutability of the past is the central tenet of Ingsoc. Past events, it's argued, have no objective existence. If the past has an objective existence, then we can compare the present to the past, and we can say, look, you promised that the abolition of private property would produce a greater welfare for all. In fact, it's made everyone worse off. Everyone, that is, except the few who are in control. And so it has not gotten better. In fact, it's gotten vastly worse since the revolution. But nobody's in a position to say that because the past is constantly changed. And what's Winston Smith's job in 1984? It's precisely to go through and change the records to reflect a revised conception of the past. Precisely so that the party can appear infallible and that no one has any basis for comparison. They try to rely on their own memories, but even their own memories are constantly under attack by the revisions of the past. I think the most fundamental point, however, is that underlying the kind of totalitarian scheme, that bleak future that Orwell paints in 1984, is a philosophical doctrine known as idealism. The idea that there is no real world objective truth that is out there waiting to be found. Instead, everything is dependent on the mind. Everything depends on our ideas, our concepts, our conceptual scheme, our language, so that we are capable of shaping the world by changing our language and changing our thinking. If there's any independent foundation for people talking about the truth, talking about the way the world is independently of our concepts, then something can challenge the infallibility of the party. The party requires an idealistic foundation. Not only can the past have no objective existence, the present can't either. Nothing can really have any objective, mind-independent existence. You believe that reality is something objective, external, existing in its own right, says O'Brien. You also believe the nature of reality is self-evident. When you delude yourself into thinking that you see something, you assume that everyone else sees the same thing as you. But it's not true, O'Brien says. In fact, everything is mind-dependent. Nothing has that mind-independent, objective existence. Nothing is really out there. Everything is ultimately in here. I tell you, Winston, that reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind and nowhere else. Not in the individual mind, which can make mistakes, and in any case soon perishes. Only in the mind of the party, which is collective and immortal. Whatever the party holds to be the truth is truth. It is impossible to see reality except by looking through the eyes of the party. That idealistic attitude and that positioning of the party as the one mind upon which everything depends, of course, makes the party infallible. It makes the individual mind and any independent fact, there really is none from this point of view, but anything that would look like an independent fact, incapable of challenging the truth put forward by the party. The truth, that is to say, in scare quotes, because of course the party can say whatever it wants. It's declared infallible from the start, and it shapes everything, including the minds, the memories, everything of the people under its control, to fit its version of reality. It claims that is the only reality. O'Brien continues, we control matter because we control the mind. Reality is inside the skull. You must get rid of those 19th century ideas about the laws of nature. We make the laws of nature. That idea, that we make the laws of nature, that nature has to conform to us and not vice versa, it's an old idea resting ultimately, I think, on the Copernican revolution of Immanuel Kant. But that thought, that it's not our job to fit our concepts to the world, but instead the world's job to fit itself to our concepts, that is the idealistic attitude underlying the party's view. It underlies the party's claim to infallibility. There is nothing objective, there's nothing independent that can challenge the views of the party. Nothing exists, O'Brien says, except through human consciousness. Outside man, there is nothing. And in fact, in his view, outside the party, there is nothing. Now you might think that in the end this view has to be false. In the end, we really do have the job of conforming our ideas to the world, and reality is going to ultimately be a test that the party will fail. In the end, it won't work. And why won't it work? Not because the party needs even stricter controls and a better system of propaganda, a better system of thought control, surveillance, etc. It's really that in the end, reality doesn't conform to the ideas of the party. The party's ideas and reality are going to get further and further apart. And eventually reality will catch up to the party and defeat its attempts to control human beings. Well, that's precisely what Winston says. But O'Brien objects. Life will defeat you. You are imagining that there's something called human nature, which will be outraged by what we do and will turn against us. But we create human nature. Men are infinitely malleable. That thought that the world depends on our ideas has to match us, and that human beings themselves are infinitely malleable and can conform to whatever the party needs them to be, is fundamental to Ingsoc. It's fundamental to the view of O'Brien and the rest of those in control in 1984. Winston Smith doesn't believe it. He says, I know that you will fail. There's something in the universe, I don't know, some spirit, some principle that you will never overcome. You might call it nature or human nature. You might call it God. You might call it some objective reality. But whatever it is, there is something that will end up defeating the party. Will end up defeating this kind of totalitarian attempt to revise everything, including the past, including our ideas, our concept of the present, including human nature itself. That in the end will triumph, will defeat the party, will make its aims unattainable. Well, it's a faith that Winston has. He refuses to give it up, at least initially. But O'Brien is not convinced. After all, this view presupposed that somewhere or other, outside oneself, there was a real world where real things happened. But how could there be such a world? What knowledge have we of anything save through our own minds? All happenings are in the mind. Whatever happens in all minds truly happens. That skeptical argument that we don't have any access to this mind-independent reality. If there's something truly out there, we can't know what it is. We can't contact it. And so in the end, what we have to call reality is simply the product of the mind. That's the chief argument that idealists have always used. Insofar as we think there really is an objective reality outside of us, we face the problem. How is it possible for us to know anything about it? And the claim is that problem can't be solved. If we have any ability to know about the world at all, the idealist claims, it must be because the world depends on our concepts. It really is itself a construction or projection of the mind. And so by changing minds, you change reality. There can't be any reality independent of what people think, how they conceive of things. In short, there can't be any objective reality independent of the mind itself. I've talked about the aims of the party. But what are the aims of the party? To maximize the happiness of the entire community? To bring about some conception of social justice? In the end, no. The party seeks power for its own sake in 1984. There is no higher ideal. If there were a higher ideal, the party could turn out not to be infallible. It could be held responsible for achieving or failing to achieve that ideal. And so not only can the past not have any independent existence, not only can reality, even in the present, have any independent existence, no ideal, no aim, no goal, no conception of social justice or happiness or human welfare or the common good or anything like that can have any independent validity either. The party cannot seek power for the sake of some kind of good, or else that good would constitute a standard by which the party itself could be judged. So the party seeks power for its own sake. O'Brien tells Winston, the party seeks power entirely for its own sake. We're not interested in the good of others. We're interested solely in power. Not wealth or luxury or long life or happiness, only power, pure power. Power is not a means, it is an end. That is indeed a bleak vision of society, a bleak vision of the future. But again, I want to stress, Orwell doesn't say this is inevitable. He doesn't say this is where we are and forevermore will be. Instead, he says this is where we might be. He's like the ghost of Christmas future. Is this the vision of what must be or only what may be? Scrooge asked that ghost. And the ghost doesn't respond, simply points. I think that's what Orwell is doing here. He's really showing us what might be, not what must be. But he's pointing toward that and warning us that if we don't change our ideas, if we don't change the conceptions we have of what's involved in seeking power, then we're going to be all too vulnerable to such a future. We'll allow it to happen. Indeed, Orwell looked around himself in the late 1940s and saw all sorts of indications that that's where things were heading. I think today if he looked around he'd see many more such indications. And indeed he might think that many of the worst fears he expressed in 1984 are in the process of coming true. I don't know whether that's the case or not, but I do think it's important to heed his warning. There are ideas that sound very attractive at first glance, that sound powerful, that sound even inevitable, and yet follow them through to their logical conclusions as they would be implemented in practice, and you get a very different vision.